I believe in general that the customer is always right, and I am biased almost always to say yes. But we're gonna find a way so that it fits within the larger product vision. I take the view that if they don't understand, it's our fault that they don't understand, not their fault, right? So it's like our product has to be better to make them figure out the better way.
I'm joined today by Matt from Bitdrift, a mobile observability startup. Matt talks about what it was like to be one of the early people at AWS and EC2 specifically. And Matt shares about working at Lyft and Twitter and launching an incredibly popular open source tool at Lyft. We talk about Bitdrift and how they spun out of Lyft and what that was like. And we talk about the importance of meeting people where they're at, shipping fast, and just being very customer focused. Enjoy the episode. I know you're like one of the key people on EC2 for a while and pretty early. What was it like at AWS when you were there?
Yeah, it's hard to describe to people, because I think when people look at AWS today, they see a business where I don't actually know what the revenue numbers are. They're in the tens or hundreds of billions now. And they probably have, I don't even know, they have tens of thousands of employees that just work within AWS. And when I joined, this is in January of 2010, there were, I think, 45 or 50 people working in EC2, and then probably 200 to 250 in all of AWS. So that included S3 and all of those things. And for me, all I can say is it was a very formative experience. From prior to AWS, I had worked at a couple of small companies, but out of college, I worked at Microsoft. And when I started working at Microsoft, this is in 2003, this is back when there was very segmented engineering. Like, you were an engineer, you were a tester, you were a product manager. No one does engineering that way anymore. Like, roles are a lot more split. But I came from a company that was born in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and things were done a certain way. And the company was used to, shipping CD-ROMs. I'm sure people that are listening don't even know what that is, but it's, people used to have a box of software that you would go and buy in a store. Like, I'm sure people don't.
My cousin used to copy them and send.
Right. But when you think about what it took to ship something that went into a store, you can't just fix it. Like, today, if something is broken, you go, oops, I guess we'll fix it and put out a hot fix or something like that. Like, there's no hot fix when you're putting out a CD. So it was a very rigorous process. And when I joined AWS or Amazon in general, it was my first real experience with like the modern way of doing internet software, where everything is chaos and everything is changing all the time. And I'll be honest, it was shocking to me. It was just shocking to me how quickly things moved, and really just how customer focused they were. Obviously, it was a rocket ship. The growth was growing at an exponential rate, but things were breaking all the time. And, things that maybe based on the relatively little career experience that I had so far, I would have said, this has to have a very rigorous process so we can get this right. That's not the way that it worked. I can recall many instances of, being on conference calls, and they would literally be trying to get the racks wired, with people yelling on the phone because there isn't enough capacity where the racks, go find the racks and the loading docks and all of those things. And many crazy stories of just trying to make this thing work and cutting corners and putting Band-Aids on. And obviously it's one of the most successful, if not most successful, businesses of all time. So I think it was a very formative experience for me, because it taught me that while it's obviously important to, have a lot of rigor and have a lot of quality, you also have to move fast, and you have to deal with the reality of growing a business. And sometimes it's not pretty.
Scaling DevTools is sponsored by WorkOS. If things start going well, some of your customers are going to start asking for enterprise features. Things like SSO, skim provisioning, role-based access control. These things are hard to build, and you could get stuck spending all your time doing that instead of actually making a great dev tool. That's why WorkOS exists. They help you with all of those enterprise features. And they're trusted by OpenAI, Vercel, and Perplexity. Here's what Kyle from Depot has to say about WorkOS.
We use WorkOS to effectively add all of the SSO and SCIM to Depot. So for us, we can effectively offer SSO and SCIM, and it's like 2 clicks of a button, and we don't ever have to think about it. It's like one of the best features that we can add to Depot, and it's super affordable, which effectively allows us to like break the SSO tax joke and essentially say like you can have SSO and SCIM as like an add-on onto your monthly plan. So it really allows smaller startups to essentially offer like that enterprise feature without a huge engineering investment behind it. Like it's literally, we can just use a tool behind the scenes and our life is exponentially easier.
Thanks again, WorkOS. Back to the episode. Is it the customer focus that was the biggest?
I think it's the customer focus. I think Amazon in general, again, I can't say as much now, but at least at the time that I was there, I just really appreciated this general sense, that the customer is always right. And that's something, obviously it probably comes from the retail background, but I think that has permeated most of what they do. And I think, when you start a company or build something or do anything, it's always this balancing act of having your own vision of what it should be and what it should do. But you're always balancing what you think and what the market actually wants. And I'm a big believer that, you want to lead the customers to the promised land where you want them to go. But if you lead them too far ahead, it's probably not going to end well. So I think Amazon, at least historically, has just done a great job of doing really innovative things. Like no one can argue that they haven't been an incredibly innovative company. But they've also built things that people want, and they haven't gotten too far ahead of that.
Yeah. And because for me, it just because I've been researching a little bit about AWS, it's just kind of crazy how much they just changed how people worked and how things were built.
Yeah. I mean, I think a great example of that comes to mind is if you look at Facebook, Meta, I don't know, they've burned tens of billions of dollars on this metaverse stuff that like literally no one wants. Not a single person wants that, right? So you could argue that they have a vision and they believe that that's where things are going and this is the future of work and all of those things. But I think just that's a great example of what I'm talking about, which is it doesn't seem like either that vision is too far ahead of where people are at or the vision is wrong. But I don't think Amazon as a company would never do that. I mean, I don't see them investing that amount of money in something like that without a bit of a higher confidence, that it would be well received, or they would fail faster, right? It's like, I think Amazon has always been very notorious about just figuring out if something is going to work, and then pulling the plug if it's not.
Yeah, my understanding of it is that they were, and correct me on this, but it's like it seemed like it was just the thing that people were struggling with the most was like knowing like the capital expense they had to put down to like even go online, so to speak, or like to expand. And it was like just all these other retailers and stuff were asking them, and everyone was struggling with it. But it just seemed like impossible. Like I don't know. Like
I think there are a lot of folk stories that have gone around. The AWS was born out of they had extra capacity that they weren't using during Christmas or something like that. And to my knowledge, that's not true. I mean, I think they just some group of them decided, and this is prior to my time. Obviously, I didn't join until 2010. So I think everything started in like the 2006, 2007 timeframe. So in the grand scheme of time, I was there very early. But, in like startup time, it was still like a little bit later. But for the people that started in 2006 and 2007, I think they just saw a need and they said, let's see if this can happen. And I think you're right. I mean, I think that in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a lot of companies that were all repeating a lot of the same infrastructure work to get their stuff online. And obviously, this is coming out of the dot-com bubble bursting in the late 90s and early 2000s. And now there's a lot more companies online, and they're all, putting servers somewhere to have a web page or something like that. And there was, during that time, obviously there was the early social media companies like Facebook, and then you have Twitter and, and other people in that time frame. And they're all solving like similar technical concerns around, you got to put servers here and do this and do that. And I think the Amazon folks, again, I wasn't there for those conversations, but I think they said there's got to be an opportunity here to, sell some of this common infrastructure. And obviously they were right. I mean, they have built an incredible business. And I think what's interesting is that as you go forward, the business has just been astounding. They've captured so much value. But it's interesting to see how things have evolved over the last like 15 years, because now it's not just them. I mean, you have Oracle that has a huge business, Google, Microsoft. I mean, there's all these other providers. And now, as a lot of the other technology has matured, there's other people that are now saying, oh, cloud's too expensive because they're charging their high markups and margins. And now we're going to move the infrastructure back. So, I mean, I think it's just a great example of being in the right place at the right time, seeing the opportunity and executing really well. And I think that's kind of what I was talking to about the craziness of that time, because I think that Amazon was uniquely positioned to capture that value because Google, Microsoft, simply too slow. I mean, it's like Google's engineering culture, as much as I've worked a lot with Google over the years, some of the smartest people in the world work at Google. They're a very deliberative bunch, right? And I don't think Google, and especially not Microsoft in that time frame, could have ever done something fast enough and at a okay enough but not awesome quality bar and get something out, because they would have always been saying, oh, this is good enough, we got to do this, do that. Amazon just said, we're just going to ship it. I mean, we're just going to put it out there. And it was rough in the beginning. And again, over time, they've done some incredibly innovative engineering to like build to that scale. But in the beginning, it was a bunch of cobbled together stuff.
Yeah. Wasn't it also like that? And sorry, this will be my last AWS question, but like, wasn't it also the kind of like they focused on like externalizing, like everything had to be like its own concern, and like they already had that culture, AWS?
Yeah, like I think what you're
Amazon,
talking
sorry.
about is
Yeah.
the everything is an API type of thing, or like everything is its own service. And I think they were doing that internally at a very early time. So I think that permeated it, but I think by the time that they launched AWS, it was pretty well established. Like that was more of a late 90s type of argument. I think by the time that AWS was launched, the fact that everything is an API or service or those kinds of things, I think that was getting on its way to be more established. I think it's more that they just saw the opportunity, that these are the building blocks. Like people need some storage, or they need to rent some servers or do these things. And most people don't want to fuss with figuring out how to put them into data centers and all of those things. So I really think it's just some smart people saw the opportunity and they were in the right place at the right time and they executed very well.
Okay, that's amazing. That's really cool. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, so then you were talking about like the social media companies, like you were at Twitter and you were at Lyft, as at this kind of like building on top of I guess the cloud services, and just how insane like the growth of the internet was. And you launched Envoy, an open source project at Lyft that became incredibly popular. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. So without getting too far into the weeds of the technical stuff, when I worked in EC2, so I've spent most of my career working on really low level technical things like operating systems and computer virtualization and networking and all of that. And when I worked in Amazon, I worked more on like the low level operating system networking type stuff. And then I left Amazon and I went to Twitter. And at Twitter, that was my first exposure to like application level computing. So again, for those of your listeners that don't know, just very quickly, all of the big services that you use, like whether it be Twitter or Facebook or Google or whatever, it's not just one computer. There's like thousands or sometimes millions of computers that are out there, making your search queries or showing you your social media feed or whatever else. And those computers have to talk to each other, and it's a pretty complicated problem to do that reliably. So when I was at Twitter, I spent a bunch of time working on, Twitter's edge system. So how Twitter would talk to the internet and how people would talk to Twitter. There's some fantastic stories from that time. A very quick one, which is well known, is that I wrote some code and it logged 40 million people out of Twitter. So that was that was a very exciting time, because obviously for these social media companies, when people get logged out, people are not happy, and because you can't serve them ads and all of that good stuff. But yeah, so that was a great experience, just learning like how these big systems are built. And then from Twitter, I went to Lyft, the ride-sharing company, and that was also fairly early in Lyft's history. I think at the time that I joined Lyft, there's probably 50 or 60 engineers. The whole company was probably like 200 or 300 people. And this was in 2015. And obviously, this was really during the height of the gig company era. There's obviously Lyft and Uber and DoorDash and Instacart and all of these companies. And during this time, there's a lot of people that are building all of these complex systems. So I think, AWS and those types of things started in, the mid 2000s. And that's when it became easier for people to get servers and start building systems. But then by the mid 2010s, tons of people are building these really complicated systems that do all these things on your phone. And they're all facing a lot of these common problems. Like, how do these servers talk to each other? And how does it all work together? Like, how do you give people a customer experience that's actually good? And as part of that, I developed a piece of open source software to help Lyft, and that was in the computer networking, application networking space. And we open sourced that software because it wasn't really Lyft's main business interest. And we open sourced that in 2016. And much to my amazement, still to this day, it became very, very popular. I mean, like popular to the extent that, I don't even know anymore. But I mean, I think in some form, probably almost every human on Earth that uses a computer probably interfaces with Envoy in some form, and is used by almost every major company around the world. So the ability to help create something like that has impacted so many people around the world. I mean, frankly, it's hard to imagine ever topping that from a career perspective. And it was shocking to me, that the software would become so popular. So I spent a lot of my time at Lyft, obviously working on that and helping Lyft with their software needs and working with the industry, to see that software adopted.
Why do you think it was such a popular piece of software?
This will get into a bit of technical detail, but I'll try to keep it simple, which is that, as I mentioned before, there's been some industry shifts during different periods of, as we go back, right? So it's like, obviously, the internet really came about during the 1990s, and that's when people first started building these large distributed systems that would serve things like Google. And then obviously cloud computing came along in the early 2000s. And then, as I mentioned, in the 2010s, people started building way more of these systems, just more systems. You think about how many companies started during that time that are now really popular. There's too many companies to count. Like, how many apps do you have on your phone? Like, many of those apps were created during the 2010s. So many people were building these systems. And one of the technical components of these systems is they tend to be very dynamic. And by dynamic, I mean that things are always failing. Like, the computing resources are coming and going, and like failures are always happening. And the big difference in the 2010s versus what came before is that most computing systems, they were a lot more fixed, if that makes sense. And by fixed, I mean, you had some machines that are in a data center somewhere. Those machines had some names. You like set up some rules, and that was what you did during that time. In the 2010s, you started having open source projects like Kubernetes and just like general infrastructure that just moved around a lot. Like, things would change all the time. And a lot of the networking software that came before wasn't really built to handle a lot of that change. So Envoy was built from the ground up to really, take that change as just the reality of way computing systems work. And because of that, it really fit a need that a lot of companies were facing, where these other systems, some great open source pieces of software that had come before, they weren't really adaptable to this new world. During that time as well, it's not just the fact that we built the software in this really adaptable way, but as you probably know, obviously people started developing software on GitHub during that time. And I think with a lot of open source software, the way that you build a larger community, the way that you bring people in, that's also a huge part of whether software and all of the stuff that happens around it becomes very popular. So unlike a lot of other systems during the time, like, we developed Envoy on GitHub. I spent an incredible amount of effort recruiting users and other maintainers, and going and giving talks at companies and conferences and all of those things. And I've said it many times, but I think that starting a very successful open source project and starting a business, they're not that different, in the sense that it's not just technical. It's like, you have all these concerns. There's like a marketing component. You got to tell people about it. There's obviously there's a hiring component. You got to find maintainers and people to work on it. I mean, there's most of the same things. Having started a business now, I'll say that statement's probably a little naive, but there are a lot of commonalities for sure.
Yeah, and maybe that's a good segue onto starting a business.
Yeah, I was gonna say that where I think that statement, while it's true, I think what I didn't really understand is that open source software is still free. And when you try to get money from people, the bar goes up even higher, right? So yeah, I think we obviously developed a lot of technology while we were at Lyft. And as I got later in my Lyft time, I think one of the things that we started to realize is there's a whole area of computing which is now called observability. Observability is basically the practice of, how do you know what your software is doing, right? You're building these like giant systems and they're doing all these things. Like, how do you know that your widget is actually producing widgets? And observability, as some of your listeners probably know, has become one of the biggest spending line items that most people spend on their computing infrastructure. It is a very big business. I mean, companies that your listeners would have heard of, like Datadog and Splunk and all these things. Yeah,
Isn't that the legendary $50 million customer
Yes.
line item or something.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
And I think for a long time, observability was probably the number 2 line item behind cloud infrastructure that most companies would spend on. Today, it's probably number 3 behind like cloud and AI, but then it's probably observability. So like observability has always been a big problem, when it comes to figuring out whether these things are working. But one of the frustrations that I've always had and something that I've always been involved in is that the vast majority of observability tools, they're focused on what I would call server side observability. So we've been talking a lot about, you have these computers that are in a data center and all of those things, and you want to know what those things are doing. But as you know, um, really the way that 90% of people interact with computers now is through their phone, right? It's like they're on their phone, they're in their apps. And a lot of times, as you and your listeners know, the apps don't really work, right? And one of my biggest personal frustrations has been that people love to talk about the reliability of their systems. By systems, I mean their server infrastructure. They talk about I got whatever, my 4.9s, my 99.99% reliability. But then like the phone is just breaking. I mean, it's like, how many times have you been, just like a personal pet peeve of mine, how many times have you been on a banking app or an airline app and like it just does not work? Like it doesn't load, it hangs. I mean, it's like really bad, right?
Yeah. And then sometimes you tell them and they're like, oh, we're not seeing any issues. And it's
Whatever.
like, but it didn't work.
It's so frustrating to me as an end user, that we've put all this effort into the server stuff, but people still don't have a great idea of what's going on the phone, like where people actually care. So while I was at Lyft, we started working on some internal systems to help really understand the reliability of what's going on and the observability of what's going on the phone. And then we're a bit of an odd situation. We actually spun out of Lyft into an independent company called Bitdrift. And that was in 2013. So, we had developed some of the technology while we were at Lyft. And then we decided that, the only way to really have a go and see if this is a viable company is to do a spin out. So not the common way that people do startups. We spun out with Lyft as a customer. They're also an investor. And we've been doing Bitdrift, which is a mobile observability company for the last 2.5 years or so.
That's really cool. Could I actually ask, like, what was it like? Like, how did that come about? Was it like just, yeah.
I'll say in all honesty, I would not do a spin out. It is a complicated process. I think how it came about for us is, I think during the early 2020s and probably late 2010s, but especially during the pandemic time when, tech valuations were booming and the economy was booming and all of these things, I think it wasn't uncommon, that at a lot of these larger companies, there were groups of people, I'll call them doing fake startups. And by fake startups, I mean, you hear lots of stories like this, right? There's some people that are building some stuff and maybe they're going to go and try to sell it and like do like a startup within a larger company. And my personal opinion, to be honest with you, is that this pretty much never works because you can't do a startup within a bigger company. It's not the right culture. It's not the right incentives. It's like it's just not. And not to mention the fact that when you're trying to sell to initial customers, a lot of them are looking at you really confused and saying, sorry, like you work at Lyft and you're trying to sell me mobile observability software, and I get it, that doesn't really make sense, right?
Yeah.
So on so many angles, I think we just realized that we think this idea has legs. We think there's a need within the market. We don't know. But let's see what we can do. And then it comes down to the question of, we've developed significant intellectual property while we're at Lyft. So then the question is, do we just leave and then have to start from scratch and lose Lyft as a customer? Or do we work with Lyft and see if we can take the IP and do a spin out and all of those things. And, I'll be honest, there's strong pros and cons for both sides. And if I had to do it again, I'd probably do the same thing, but it's not super cut and dry. And I think that mostly we just said that we need to be an independent company in order to do this for real. So we have to explore how to make that happen. And it was a pretty lengthy process, not the most pleasant one, but I don't think anything involving a lot of lawyers can be. And I think we made it happen, and we left Lyft on good terms and all of those things, and that was fantastic. So I think that when we left Lyft, what was interesting, I think most startups, they start with no customers, and they're desperately trying to find initial customers and find product market fit. And I think what's interesting about our company is that we left with a big customer, but one customer is not product market fit. So you're kind of like in this weird situation where you have a big customer, but one customer, having worked there and done all of those things, is not product market fit. So, we spent the first 6 months of the company just launching publicly, because obviously we didn't have like a public website when we left. So you had to do all those things, do public launching and all of that. And then, the last year and a half to 2 years has been obviously iterating on the product like any other startup would, and figure out, does this thing have product market fit? And it's been a journey for sure. It's like, I think anyone that tells you that starting a company is easy is absolutely lying to you, because it is a difficult journey for sure.
Yeah, actually, like really curious. What was it like? How do you kind of go from, like, I guess something that has got, well, I don't know what the right word is, but like you've got some sort of product fit with product lift fit, where like
Right.
you've built something that they love, or that you loved, I guess, when you were there as well. And like how different is it to like get that to a point where other people?
I mean, it's frankly, it's super different. I mean, part of it is Lyft. At the time that we left Lyft, is a very sophisticated company, right? And by sophisticated, I mean, it had over the years a lot of great engineers that build a lot of great technologies. Like, its mobile app was and is very good, right? I mean, it's like a lot of
Yeah.
people had put a lot of effort in. They're a mobile first business. So like Lyft in some ways is not the best customer for like what we're trying to do, just in the sense that their app already is very good, right? So it's
Yeah.
like, whereas what you're trying to do is you're trying to help up level all the other apps, the ones that shall not be named, but maybe we alluded to before, right? Where
Yeah.
the apps, tons of people use them, they generate lots of revenue for these companies, but the app quality is not that great. Um, and I think that, figuring out how do we reach developers and build a business where developers are, right? Meaning, it's like, this actually comes back to the beginning of our conversation, where I can have a vision all day of how I, want mobile observability to be, and how I want app development to be, and all of those things. But if I'm too far ahead of the average developer, they're going to look at me like I'm crazy, and they're going to tell me to go away, right? And I think what we realized, a very concrete thing, is, most mobile developers, partly because mobile observability, without getting into a lot of technical details, unless you want, is very difficult. Like, it's just hard. And it's hard because the phones have sporadic connectivity. They have low resources. The apps are like turning on, turning off all the time, or they're getting background or like whatever else. It's very complicated. Most mobile developers, they don't know observability. They never had observability. All they have is crash reporting, right? It's like,
Crashlytics or whatever.
yeah. It's like they have Crashlytics, they have Bugsnag, they have Sentry, and those are great products, great tools, right? But all they tell you is, did the app crash? And what almost every company will tell you, every established company, is that crashes are 99.995% of sessions, user sessions, are crash free. So only 0.01% of sessions are crashing, right? So that means, and yes, like crashing is a problem. Obviously, if you have a big crashing event, that's bad. But most of the problems that you and I are talking about, like the app hanging, or like, how many times do you rage quit some app because it's frozen, or, it just doesn't load, or like it's too slow and you get frustrated and leave. None of that's covered by crashes, right? And for most apps, we would argue that spending your time on crashes is not actually the best use of time for your customers. It's fixing all the other problems. But as a company for Bitdrift, we realize probably halfway into the last 2 years that customers know crash reporting, and asking them to adopt this new tool when it doesn't have crash reporting and they still have to have a crash analytics for all of those things, that's a pretty tough sell, right? Because they're going to say, well, I still need crash reporting. And that's true. I mean, it's like, if you have a bad crashing event, that's bad. So we ended up adding crash reporting to Bitdrift. And that's because we need to meet customers where they are, and then we need to lead them to this promised place. And, knock on table, I feel very optimistic about where the company is going at this point. We're on the verge of, I think, going to sign some very big deals with some very large companies. And we never would have done those deals if we hadn't added crash reporting. So that's just like a really great example of where I really believe that, you have to lead, but you can't lead too far. It's like we have to build the products that people understand and they want to use, and then we can take them further.
Because then I see what else they get from Bitdrift.
Yeah, exactly.
Like they come for the
Yeah, I mean, they might come for crash reporting, or some people might come for what in the industry we would call RUM, like real user monitoring, or like observability, or those kinds of things. There might be a segment. There's typically a segment of the company that wants to look at performance traces and session replays and all of those things. And our big innovation at Bitdrift, like where we thought that we could provide the most value, since we didn't really talk about that yet, is we take a pretty different approach. Most observability tools, they send all their data to some backend service, which does the processing and shows you all those nice things. When you're dealing with 50 or hundreds of millions of phones, this is a very large amount of data, like not to mention the performance overhead that it has on the phone itself for taking more data that could be used for other things, and processing power and all of that. And what we do at Bitdrift, which is very different, is we store the data locally on the device. And then partly from the learnings that we had building Envoy, of building this control plane, I talked to you a bit about like dynamic infrastructure. We treat these phones as kind of dynamic pieces, and in real time, we can tell the phones what to do. So basically, we can say, you are in San Francisco on this app version, and if you see this, and this, dump all the data and get me a full trace, and like do all of those things. And this is incredibly powerful, and it really appeals to large companies, because now they don't have to ingest all their data. They can just ingest the pieces that they need to get the performance data to debug certain things. So it's a very different way of doing things, but still, it's a different way of thinking. It's a different way of capturing the data. And if we only had that, I don't think that we would be as far along as we are now, mostly because people would still come to us and say, that's fantastic, but I still need crash reporting. And like, are you telling me that I still have to have this other vendor, and I don't want multiple vendors, right? I mean, it's like all the typical stories of how you purchase software. So it's the best example that I can give of where you can build amazing technology all day long, but if you're not meeting customers where they are, I just think it's almost hopeless. And I think that even for what we're building, even if customers are not immediately going to replace some of our competitors who are doing the crash reporting piece, if they can see a path to where in the future they could, and they can, because as you know, I mean, people always, they want less tools, not more. No one wants more tools. So if they can see a path to having less tools, that's a positive for sure.
Yeah, I really like the way you put it about meeting people where they are. Because I always, even just like, I always like to put tools in boxes of like, okay, this is, because it just helps you as well, I think, like to just think about things, and then you can think of like extend the definition and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think too. I mean, everyone in our industry for as long as I can remember, especially in the observability space, but not just there. They're always talking about the quote single pane of glass, right? It's like you're gonna go to one tool. That's the one tool that's gonna rule them all, and in that tool, you're gonna get like all the other stuff because people don't want to click to different tabs and do all of those things.
Yeah.
And I mean, again, people have been talking about that for as long as I've been in the computing industry. It's long time. And I've come to realize that it's a noble goal, but it's not necessarily realistic. But I think using that as a North Star around, can we help people maybe go from 5 tools to 4? I think most people would say that is a great thing. And I think especially in the mobile space, what we see is there's almost this like Venn diagram of tools that started in different areas, right? So there's like the error reporting, crash reporting tools. That would be like a Crashalytics, Sentry, Bugsnag, those types of things. Then there's, the tools that started more on like the RUM or observability side. So that'd be like Datadog, RUM, New Relic, like those kinds of things. Then there are people on the analytics side, companies like Amplitude or Mixpanel. And over time, not surprisingly, a lot of these tools have, they've started to like morph into the same thing. But you don't talk to any customer who's like, yeah, I really like having an analytics tool, a RUM tool, and a crash reporting tool. Like no one says that. So I think it's more, what is the path that we can get to a place where, as I mentioned before, we can really help people debug a lot of those usability issues that are at the core of most computing experiences today. But they still need those other Venn diagram pieces. So we do ultimately have to have a path, hopefully a compelling story of how we can get to one tool. Not to mention all the other complexity of purchasing software, where people might say, great, you do mobile, but do you do web? Since 10% of my traffic is on web, but then I have this whole other set of tools for that. So I think again, I've really opened my eyes to the fact that amazing technology only gets you so far. There is a lot of realities of just selling software, that have to be there before people will purchase.
Amazing. So would your big takeaways for other founders listening would be meet people where they are? It feels like the theme. Or
I mean, I think my first thing would be make sure you enjoy pain if you're going to start a company. It's definitely not for the faint of heart. And you can see the overnight success stories on LinkedIn all day, but I think very few of them are actually true. And it is a hard path. It is very rewarding, but it's a hard path. And I think, especially when we talk about like, I can't talk about all startups, but I think in the developer tooling space, whether it be observability or any other tool, that we're talking about. And we saw this when we did Envoy as well, just in terms of you can do all these things. And I think one of the reasons that Envoy became so popular is I am also very customer focused. And maybe that came from Amazon. Maybe it's just in my own personality. I believe in general that the customer is always right. And I am biased almost always to say yes. And when we did Envoy, I would phrase it in a way of saying, yes, but, right? I mean, like the answer is always yes, but we're going to find a way so that it fits within the larger product vision, right? And
Mm.
and I think that so many people can get stuck and saying that, no, that's not right. This is not the way that it's supposed to work. Like what, he or she is asking is stupid or something like that. And I take a very different view, which is that people are not going to, like, they're not asking, like, they're asking because they want something, right? Like it might be that they don't understand, or maybe there's a better way or whatever, but I take the view that if they don't understand, it's our fault that they don't understand, not their fault, right? So it's like our product has to be better to make them figure out the better way. So
Mm.
that's a long way of saying that I always take that approach of, they're asking for a reason. We have to figure out a way to help them, whether that be improving documentation, adding a feature, like making the feature more clear or something like that. And I just believe that over time, again, it's like you can be customer focused all day. And if you're building something that like absolutely no one wants, it's obviously not going to work. But assuming that you have something that people generally want, and at Bitdrift or with Envoy, I think that is true. I think that a lot of the nuts and bolts, the day-to-day, is just hammering away at
Mm.
what are they asking? Why? Let's figure out how to make that happen. And with so much software, again, I'm not going to name names, but I think some of the customers that we're working with, I think they're just thrilled with the fact that we're responsive. We listen to them, like we're figuring out ways to help them. And other companies, okay, yeah, hi, it's on the roadmap. We'll, talk to you in 2027 or something like that. And
Yeah.
I get it. We're a small startup. We can be more nimble, but I think that Amazon is actually, at least historically, is an example of where, I mean, they do iterate on customer requests, right? And they have done it at a very large scale. Again, maybe not as much as they used to, but I think for a giant megacorp, they maintain that culture for a very long time, which is fairly impressive to me.
Yeah. Yeah. This is amazing. And I really enjoyed hearing this, Matt. And I think you explain things really well, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
It's
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Where can people learn more about Bitdrift and about you?
In the old days, I would have said Twitter, but that doesn't really exist anymore. So, it's a totally separate conversation. But one of my, I miss the old Twitter. Like I actually miss having that space where people can just talk and have these conversations. And like I thought that maybe it was going to be blue sky, but it's not really. And it seems like it's LinkedIn, I guess. I don't know, which seems bizarre to me, but I guess LinkedIn. Anyway, you can, would love to talk to you, and you can shoot me an email. I actually have I have a website, mattcline123.dev. There's Bitdrift.io, the website. I'm on Blue Sky, LinkedIn. Obviously, would love to talk to anyone.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Matt. And
Yeah.
thanks everyone for listening.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.